In an exclusive medical facility, impossible test results challenge everything a wealthy man thought he knew about himself. For small faces mirror his own, defying years of medical certainty. Within the confines of luxury and privilege, science unveils a truth that will reshape not just one life, but an entire legacy. Between disbelief and discovery lies a story that will leave everyone speechless. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The penthouse apartment, a testament to Arthur Blackwood's success, felt colder than ever. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the storm raging inside him. He stared at the crisp, clinical report, the words blurring despite their stark clarity. Biological father, quadruplets. The phrase echoed in the cavernous silence, a cruel joke played by a capricious fate. He ran a hand through his meticulously styled hair, the gesture betraying the carefully constructed composure he usually maintained. The polished marble floor felt unforgiving beneath his bare feet. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound utterly foreign to the man who'd always prided himself on control. Years of infertility treatments, countless consultations with the world's leading specialists, all rendered meaningless by this single, devastating piece of paper. The irony wasn't lost on him. His life, built on precision and unwavering ambition, was shattered by a biological fact he couldn't comprehend. The muted chime of his phone startled him. It was Dr. Thorne, his voice a calm counterpoint to the tempest in Arthur's soul. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand this is unexpected. We need to discuss the next steps." Arthur's voice, usually commanding, was a strained whisper. "Next steps? What next steps? This is impossible." The silence stretched, punctuated only by the relentless drumming of the rain. He pictured the doctor's concerned expression, a stark contrast to the detached professionalism he usually projected. I need time," Arthur finally managed, his voice cracking. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, landing with a soft thud on the polished surface of his desk. His meticulously crafted world was crumbling around him, and he was utterly unprepared for the wreckage. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the rich leather and mahogany of Arthur's penthouse. He sat, rigid, the doctor's words echoing in the cavernous silence. Quadruplets. The word felt like a physical blow, each syllable a hammer against his carefully constructed reality. He traced the edge of the report, the crisp paper a cruel mockery of his meticulously ordered life. The rain outside intensified, mirroring the storm within. Dr. Thorne, a man known for his calm demeanor, seemed almost hesitant. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, his voice soft yet firm, "this is understandably shocking, but the DNA evidence is irrefutable. We have photographs." He hesitated, holding out a small, pristine envelope. Arthur stared at the envelope, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest of the chair. He felt a tremor run through him, a physical manifestation of his disbelief. He had spent years chasing the elusive dream of fatherhood, only to be met with disappointment, the whispers of infertility a constant, gnawing presence. Now this, a sudden, overwhelming reality. He opened the envelope slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. For faces stared back at him, miniature versions of his own, eyes wide and innocent. A gasp escaped his lips, a sound of utter disbelief mixed with something else. A flicker of something akin to recognition, a nascent feeling he couldn't quite name. They look like me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Dr. Thorne nodded gently, his gaze filled with compassion. "The resemblance is striking. We've arranged for you to see more, to help you process this information." The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through him. Process this? How do you process something like this? My whole life. He trailed off, the carefully constructed facade crumbling before the weight of this impossible truth. Years of planning, of building his empire, of avoiding vulnerability, all now threatened by these four small faces, these impossible, undeniable children. The rain continued its relentless assault, a fitting soundtrack to the chaos within him. The carefully crafted world Arthur Blackwood had built was not only crumbling. It was dissolving into the tempest of his own making. The sterile white of the consultation room seemed to amplify the tremor in Arthur's hands. He stared at the photographs again, for tiny faces mirroring his own, a genetic echo he couldn't comprehend. The scent of antiseptic clashed with the phantom smell of his penthouse. Leather, mahogany, the faint, expensive aroma of his private cigar humidor. A world away, yet impossibly close. Dr. Thorne, sensing his distress, offered a glass of water. "Mr. Blackwood," he said softly, his voice a calm counterpoint to the storm raging within Arthur. "This is a significant revelation. We understand this is difficult." Arthur's voice was a raw whisper. "Difficult? Cataclysmic. My entire life, meticulously planned, meticulously built, gone." He ran a hand through his impeccably styled hair, disheveling it for the first time in years. The gesture felt liberating, a small rebellion against the controlled facade he had maintained for so long. The doctor nodded, his compassion evident. "The initial shock is understandable. We've arranged for a genetic counselor to discuss the implications further. And, if you're ready, we can discuss arranging a meeting." The word meeting hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. A meeting with the children. The thought sparked a strange mixture of dread and something else. A flicker of something akin to hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing. Arthur looked at the photos once more, his gaze lingering on the smallest one, a girl with his own stubborn jawline. He saw not just a genetic replica, but a tiny human being, complete with her own unique spirit, reflected in her eyes. A profound loneliness, a void he hadn't acknowledged until now, clawed at him. This wasn't just a medical anomaly. It was a potential for connection, for a love he hadn't known he was capable of. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the window pane, a relentless rhythm echoing the turmoil within him. Yet, as he looked again at the four tiny faces, a faint, hesitant smile touched his lips. The storm within might rage, but a tiny seed of hope, fragile yet tenacious, had begun to take root. The meticulously constructed world he had built might be crumbling, but something else was emerging from the ruins, something far more profound and far more precious. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur like a second skin, a stark contrast to the bespoke fragrance of his usual environment. He sat, rigid and unyielding, the photographs of the quadruplets lying on the polished mahogany table like accusing witnesses. Each tiny face, a miniature version of his own, tugged at something deep within him, a dormant instinct he'd long suppressed. Dr. Thorne, a man whose compassion was as evident as his professionalism, leaned forward. "Mr. Blackwood, we've confirmed the genetic link beyond any doubt. The probability of this coincidence is statistically insignificant." His voice was gentle, carefully calibrated to avoid further shattering Arthur's already fragile composure. Arthur's gaze remained fixed on the photos, for pairs of eyes stared back, innocent and unknowing, yet somehow accusing. Years of meticulously constructed denial crumbled under the weight of undeniable truth. "It's impossible," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. The polished surface of the table seemed to reflect his own fractured reflection, a man stripped bare of his carefully crafted persona. A wave of nausea washed over him. The opulent comfort of his penthouse felt miles away, replaced by this stark, clinical reality. He thought of his meticulously planned schedule, his board meetings, the power lunches, the carefully curated image he presented to the world. All of it felt flimsy, irrelevant, as though constructed on shifting sands. Dr. Thorne placed a comforting hand on Arthur's arm. "The initial reaction is often overwhelming. This isn't something you have to process alone. We have resources, support." Arthur brushed the doctor's hand away, the gesture sharper than intended. "Support? What kind of support can you offer when my entire life is a lie?" He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, the sound jarring in the quiet room. He paced, his expensive suit feeling like a suffocating cage. 20 years of infertility treatments, of doctors assuring me it was impossible. His voice cracked, the carefully controlled facade finally giving way to raw, unadulterated pain. He stopped pacing, his back to the doctor, a solitary figure in a vast room. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken emotion. The weight of his carefully constructed world collapsing around him was almost unbearable. Then, a single tear traced a path down his cheek, followed by another and another, until the carefully crafted dam of his emotions finally broke. He didn't try to stop the tears. He let them flow, a silent acknowledgement of a life irrevocably changed. A faint whisper escaped his lips, almost inaudible. "What do I do now?" The sterile white walls of the consultation room seemed to amplify the silence, a stark contrast to the hushed opulence of Arthur's penthouse. He stared at the photographs again, for identical faces staring back, miniature reflections of his own sharp features, his own brooding intensity. Each tiny mouth was slightly open, as if mid-breath, a silent gasp of existence mirroring his own stunned disbelief. The scent of antiseptic, sharp and clinical, battled with the faint, lingering trace of his expensive cologne, a poignant reminder of the life he knew. Dr. Thorne, his voice a low, calming counterpoint to the chaos in Arthur's mind, spoke softly. "The DNA evidence is irrefutable, Mr. Blackwood. There's no margin for error." Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat constricting his breath. But 20 years of tests, specialists, treatments, all proclaiming infertility. It's a medical impossibility. His voice cracked, betraying the carefully constructed composure he'd maintained for so long. The doctor's hand rested briefly on Arthur's arm, a gesture of quiet empathy. "The human body is capable of surprising things, Mr. Blackwood, sometimes even defying the most accepted scientific norms." Arthur flinched, pulling away. The touch, meant to comfort, only heightened his feeling of exposure, of being stripped bare. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture more agitated than controlled. This changes everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken implications. His empire, built on precision and control, felt suddenly precarious, threatened by this unexpected, overwhelming truth. The carefully manicured facade, so meticulously maintained, was cracking under the strain of this revelation. He felt a profound sense of betrayal, not just from his body, but from the very fabric of his meticulously crafted life. A lifetime of planning, of calculated moves, shattered by the innocent gaze of 4 tiny faces. The polished mahogany table seemed to mock his distress, reflecting his fractured image, a man drowning in a sea of disbelief. He looked down at the photos again, the small faces accusing, unknowing, yet undeniably his. A single tear escaped, followed by another, then a cascade, breaking the dam of his carefully controlled emotions. He wasn't simply shocked, he was terrified. The world he knew had irrevocably shifted, and the future stretched before him, vast, unknown, and utterly terrifying. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur like a second skin. He sat hunched over the photographs, the glossy paper cool beneath his trembling fingers. 4 identical faces stared back, miniature versions of his own sharp jawline, his own brooding gaze. He traced the delicate curve of a tiny hand, a hand that held the power to unravel his meticulously crafted existence. "Impossible," he whispered, the word catching in his throat, a choked sob escaping. Dr. Thorne, a tall, slender man with kind eyes that belied his unwavering professionalism, sat opposite him. The low hum of the air conditioning felt oppressive, a relentless reminder of the controlled environment that couldn't contain the storm raging within Arthur. "The tests are conclusive, Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Thorne said gently, his voice a soothing balm against the raw wound of disbelief. "We've run multiple analyses. There is no doubt." Arthur laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. The laughter died quickly, leaving behind a hollow ache. 20 years, he rasped, his voice raw with pain. 20 years of specialists, of treatments, of hope, dashed against the rocks of this impossibility. He felt a tremor run through him, a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. He pushed the photographs away, the glossy surfaces reflecting his haunted face. The mahogany table felt cold beneath his hands. He longed for the familiar comfort of his penthouse, for the sanctuary of his meticulously ordered world. But this sterile room, this shocking revelation, was his new reality. The weight of it pressed down, suffocating him. The carefully constructed facade of control he'd spent a lifetime building was crumbling, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. He was a stranger in his own life, lost in a labyrinth of shattered certainty. The faces in the photographs, so innocent, so undeniably his, were accusing him of a life he hadn't lived, a fatherhood he'd never known. He closed his eyes, the sharp scent of antiseptic stinging his nostrils, the silent hum of the air conditioner a relentless pulse in his ears, a rhythm mirroring the frantic beat of his heart. His meticulously crafted life had shattered, and the pieces were scattered around him, sharp and dangerous. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy as the antiseptic scent. Her voice was low, devoid of accusation, yet filled with a profound sadness. He saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a weary acceptance that chilled him to the bone. He shifted uncomfortably in the plush chair, the leather cool against his skin. The sunlight streaming through the window felt harsh, revealing the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, mocking spirits. I want to know them," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the photos again. The faces weren't just miniature replicas of his own. They seemed to emanate a quiet strength, a resilience he hadn't known he could admire so deeply. Elena watched him, her expression unreadable. A single tear tracked a path through the fine lines etched around her eyes, reflecting the light like a tiny, captive star. "They deserve a father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The simple statement hung in the air, laden with both hope and despair. The silence that followed was different this time, not a chasm, but a shared space of grief, regret, and a tentative opening for something more. Arthur felt the crushing weight of his past lift slightly. A small, fragile hope bloomed within him, a tiny seed in the barren landscape of his past. The journey ahead was daunting, but for the first time, he felt a surge of determination, not just for himself, but for the 4 tiny faces staring back at him from the faded photographs. The scent of jasmine hung in the air, a promise of a future he was finally ready to face. The old leather-bound photo album lay open on Arthur's lap, its pages brittle with age. Each photo, a tiny snapshot of a life he'd never known, felt like a punch to the gut. He traced the downy cheek of one of the quadruplets, a tiny replica of his own hand. The scent of Elena's jasmine perfume, faint but persistent, clung to the aged pages, a phantom touch from a past he was only beginning to understand. A memory flickered. A crowded Parisian cafe, the clatter of espresso cups a discordant soundtrack to the furtive glances he'd exchanged with Elena. Her eyes, the same intense green as the children's, had held a mix of defiance and vulnerability that had both captivated and unnerved him. He'd been drawn to her like a moth to a flame, consumed by a desire that he'd quickly suppressed, buried beneath the carefully constructed walls of his ambition. He flipped a page, stopping at a blurry image of Elena cradling the infants. Their tiny fingers curled around hers, a poignant symbol of the bond he'd missed. A wave of guilt, sharp and sudden, washed over him. They were born on a Tuesday. Elena's voice, soft and tinged with melancholy, broke through his reverie. She stood in the doorway of the opulent suite, the afternoon sun painting her silhouette against the glass. "Tuesday," he echoed, the word catching in his throat. 3 days he'd spent with her, a whirlwind romance ignited in a foreign city. 3 days of passion, recklessness, and then silence. The chasm between then and now felt insurmountable. Elena approached, her movements fluid and graceful, yet her eyes were wary. "I didn't want to burden you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the words carefully chosen. "I hoped, you'd never know." He looked up at her, at the faint lines of worry etched around her eyes, the weariness etched into her posture. He saw not a villain, but a woman who had carried a heavy burden alone, for years. He searched for words, inadequate against the enormity of his feelings. "I want to be a father to them." The word surprised him, a declaration of intent that resonated deeply within him, despite his initial fear and disbelief. Elena's guarded expression softened fractionally, a hint of hope shimmering in her green eyes. The silence that followed wasn't an abyss of regret, but a fertile ground where something new could perhaps begin to grow. The jasmine scent intensified, a heady fragrance intertwining with the sharp sting of his own self-reproach. The journey ahead loomed, but he was finally ready to face it, not alone. The crisp, sterile scent of the hospital was a stark contrast to the plush comfort of Arthur's penthouse. He held a framed photograph, the 4 tiny faces staring back at him with an unnerving familiarity. Their eyes, the same intense emerald green as Elena's, held a silent question he was desperately trying to answer. A wave of emotion, guilt, fear, a nascent tenderness washed over him. He traced the outline of a tiny hand, its delicate fingers curled around a rattle. The image was blurry, yet their resemblance to him was undeniable. He swiped a thumb across the screen of his tablet, moving to a video. The sound of infant gurgles filled the room, a chaotic symphony of tiny lives. One of the quadruplets, a girl with a mop of dark hair, gurgled happily, reaching out a chubby fist towards the camera. He felt a pang in his chest, a sharp ache that surprised him with its intensity. It wasn't just the physical resemblance. It was the depth of emotion the video unlocked. A warmth spread through him, chasing away the cold dread that had consumed him. Later that evening, a voicemail from Dr. Thorne played. "Mr. Blackwood," the doctor's calm voice said, "I've arranged for you to have access to more videos and photos. Please, allow yourself to connect with them. They are your children." Arthur sat back, the cool leather of his chair doing little to soothe the turmoil within him. He was a man of control, of meticulous planning, yet here he was utterly adrift, his carefully constructed life crumbling around him. The photos, the videos were cracks in the carefully built wall of his denial. He was starting to see that beyond the shock and the fear, there was something else, something beautiful and terrifying. He knew this was just the beginning of a journey that would test him, a journey into a fatherhood he'd never envisioned, into a past he'd desperately tried to forget. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. Yet, in the depths of that weight, a tiny seed of hope began to sprout, fed by the silent promise of 4 small faces staring back from a photograph. The private investigator, a woman named Isabella Rossi with eyes as sharp as flint, presented Arthur with a worn photograph. It depicted a younger, carefree Elena, laughing beside a vibrant seaside cafe in the south of France. "This was taken a week before she left for America," Isabella said, her voice low. The scent of old paper and faint perfume clung to the photograph. Arthur felt a jolt. He recognized the cafe. He'd been there, a fleeting memory surfacing from a hazy past. He'd been escaping, burying himself in work after the incident, the infertility diagnosis, the cold, clinical pronouncements of the doctors. He'd pushed it all down, built walls around his pain. "Did she mention anyone she met there?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. The taste of dust and regret filled his mouth. Isabella leaned forward, her expression serious. "There's mention of a businessman, wealthy, aloof. She didn't name him, but there's a description that fits you, Mr. Blackwood." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The plush velvet of his office chair felt suffocating. He stared at the photograph, the image of Elena's joy, a cruel mockery of his current despair. He'd built his life on control, on a carefully constructed persona, and now it was crumbling, revealing a man far more vulnerable and flawed than he ever wanted to acknowledge. The fear was a physical weight, a leaden cloak wrapped around his chest. He swiped through more photos on his tablet, each one a punch to the gut. His children's faces, their tiny hands, their innocent eyes were starting to seep into the fortress he'd built around his heart. He saw himself in them, a reflection he couldn't ignore, a truth he couldn't deny. The sound of their gurgles, their laughter, was a symphony of emotions he'd never experienced. He felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through him, a tenderness that shocked and frightened him in equal measure. The fear remained, sharp and undeniable, but now a new emotion was taking root, the potential of love, a terrifying, beautiful, overwhelming love. He needed to know Elena. He needed to know them all. The grainy quality of the video felt like a physical barrier. Arthur stared, mesmerized, at the tiny figures on the screen. For identical faces, chubby cheeks dimpled with smiles, gurgled happily as a woman, presumably Elena, playfully bounced them on her knee. The scent of baby powder and sunshine seemed to waft from the screen, a phantom smell triggering a phantom ache. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, a constriction unlike any he'd ever experienced. Fear, yes, but laced with something else, something akin to longing. He reached out a trembling hand, tracing the outline of one tiny face on the screen. The child, a girl, giggled, a sound that resonated deep within him, jarring loose something long buried. The sterile calm of his penthouse felt suffocating, the opulent surroundings suddenly irrelevant. Days bled into weeks. He found himself compulsively watching the videos, the raw, unfiltered joy of the children chipping away at the icy walls he'd built around his heart. He'd started keeping a small notebook, scribbling down observations, the way one child always reached for a specific toy, the melodic gurgle of another, the way they all seemed to mirror each other's emotions. One evening, a particularly poignant video showed Elena singing a lullaby. Her voice, soft and melodic, resonated with a depth of emotion that surprised him. He found himself captivated not just by the children, but by her. The initial anger and suspicion were slowly, grudgingly giving way to something else, a hesitant curiosity, a cautious hope. He picked up his phone, his finger hovering over Elena's number. The simple act felt monumental, a step into the unknown. He hesitated, the fear of rejection a tangible presence. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed the call button. The ringing tone felt like a drumbeat in his ears. He knew this call could change everything. And as the call connected, a wave of both terror and exhilaration washed over him. He was about to confront not only his past, but the potential for a future he'd never imagined. The call went to voicemail. The silence that followed felt heavier than the opulent silence of his penthouse. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, coated his tongue. He stared at the phone, the polished chrome reflecting his own grim face. He'd rehearsed the conversation a dozen times, each iteration ending differently, each tinged with the fear of rejection. He'd imagined her anger, her accusations, her refusal, but the voicemail felt worse. It was the absence of anything, a void echoing the emptiness he'd carried for so long. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid swirling in the glass like a miniature storm. The ice clinked softly, a fragile counterpoint to the turmoil inside him. The scent of the liquor, sharp, smoky, did little to soothe the gnawing unease. He needed answers, needed to understand. The children's faces swam before his eyes, their innocent smiles a stark contrast to the turmoil in his own life. Later that night, he found himself back at the videos. This time, he focused on Elena. Her eyes, dark and expressive, held a resilience that mirrored her strength. He saw the weariness in her posture, the way her smile sometimes didn't quite reach her eyes. He watched her interact with the children, the tenderness in her touch, the patience in her voice. He saw glimpses of a woman who'd carried a burden alone, a woman he'd wronged without even knowing it. The next day, he hired a private investigator, not to dig up dirt on Elena, but to unearth his own past, to piece together the fragments of a memory he didn't even know existed. He felt a strange sense of anticipation mingled with dread. Uncovering the truth might shatter the fragile peace he'd begun to feel, but it was a peace built on lies, and he couldn't stand it any longer. He needed to confront his ghosts, to acknowledge his responsibility, to finally face the man he had become, and the man he could still be. The weight of the past pressed down on him, a heavy cloak in the opulent confines of his luxurious life. But now he was ready. He had to be. The faces of his children, those 4 tiny mirrors reflecting a part of himself he'd never known, spurred him on. He would unravel this mystery, even if it cost him everything. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lilies. Arthur sat rigidly, the plush armchair offering little comfort. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He'd rehearsed this moment, but nothing could prepare him for the reality of seeing them. For tiny faces, reflections of his own, yet utterly alien. A nurse, her smile strained, ushered him through a door painted a surprisingly cheerful yellow. The room was bathed in soft light, a stark contrast to the sterile clinical areas he'd traversed. Toys lay scattered across a brightly colored rug, a chaotic yet comforting jumble. And then he saw them, for small figures, engrossed in a building block tower, their tiny hands surprisingly deft. One, a girl with his dark hair, looked up, her eyes, startlingly similar to his own, widening in curiosity. "Daddy?" she whispered, the word tentative, uncertain. The word struck him like a physical blow. "Daddy." The sound was foreign, yet deeply resonant. He felt a lump form in his throat, a mixture of awe and terror. He knelt, his tailored suit suddenly feeling inappropriate, clumsy. "Hello," he managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. He reached out a trembling hand, hesitant, and the girl took it, her grip surprisingly strong. Her fingers, small and soft, wrapped around his. He felt a wave of emotion wash over him, so intense it brought tears to his eyes. He fought back the urge to cry, the years of carefully constructed emotional control threatening to shatter. He looked at the other 3, their faces a mix of apprehension and quiet observation. One boy, a mirror image of himself at that age, stared intently at the floor, his brow furrowed in concentration. Another, a girl with bright, curious eyes, watched him with unwavering attention. The last, a smaller boy, giggled, his chubby hand reaching for a bright red block. The next hour blurred into a kaleidoscope of shared smiles, tentative touches, and the quiet murmur of children's voices. He read them a story, his voice cracking at times, his throat tight with emotion. He felt an overwhelming rush of love, a connection so profound it shook him to his core. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart crumbled, revealing a depth of feeling he'd never allowed himself to acknowledge. The impossible had happened. He was a father, and in that moment nothing else mattered. The yellow room, vibrant against the sterile white of the hospital, felt strangely comforting. The scent of baby powder and something faintly sweet, like vanilla, hung in the air. Arthur, still stiff in his suit, knelt, the plush carpet a surprisingly soft contrast to the hard hospital floors. He watched them, mesmerized, for tiny versions of himself, each unique, each captivating. The girl with his dark hair, the one who'd called him daddy, had now nestled against him, her small hand clutching his. He could feel the warmth of her skin against his, a startlingly intimate contact. He looked into her eyes, dark pools reflecting his own shock, and then something else. Trust. A tentative, fragile trust that pierced through his years of carefully constructed emotional barriers. "They're beautiful," he whispered, his voice cracking. The words felt inadequate, clumsy, like the ill-fitting suit he still wore. A boy, his mirror image, finally looked up. His eyes, the same shade of gray, were wary, assessing. "Are you really our daddy?" he asked, his voice small, a little questioning. Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat growing. "Yes," he said, the word finally finding its voice. "Yes, I am." The admission resonated within him, shaking his carefully built world to its foundations. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly overwhelming. The other 2, A girl with bright, inquisitive eyes and a giggling boy watched him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He felt a profound tenderness swell within him, a love so fierce, so overwhelming, it was both terrifying and strangely liberating. This wasn't the meticulously planned life he'd built. This was something bigger, something real, something that shattered his carefully constructed world, yet simultaneously filled the empty spaces he hadn't known existed. The impossible had happened, and in the face of it all, he felt strangely at peace. The years of loneliness, the carefully constructed walls, they were crumbling, replaced by a love so intense it left him speechless. This was a new beginning, a new chapter, and despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, he was ready. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Arthur's clothes, a stark contrast to the faint vanilla scent of baby powder still clinging to his skin. He sat in a plush armchair, the soft leather a welcome change from the hard hospital chairs, yet offering little comfort. He watched them, for miniature versions of himself, playing with brightly colored blocks in the sunlit playroom. Each child, a unique blend of his own features, stirred a new wave of emotions. Liam, his mirror image, focused intently on building a tower, his brow furrowed in concentration. The eldest girl, Chloe, with his dark hair but brighter eyes, hummed a tuneless melody as she meticulously arranged the blocks in a rainbow pattern. Then there were the twins, Finn and Maya, their playful energy a whirlwind of giggles and near collisions. A nurse entered, offering a tray of juice boxes. Chloe, sensing Arthur's hesitant gaze, looked up, a shy smile gracing her lips. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The word, so small, yet so monumental, sent a shiver down Arthur's spine. He managed a weak smile, the gesture feeling both clumsy and overwhelmingly tender. He watched them, a mix of awe and trepidation churning within him. The meticulously crafted life he'd built, the fortress of success and solitude, felt insignificant compared to the raw, untamed emotion these tiny humans evoked. His carefully constructed walls, designed to protect against vulnerability, were crumbling, brick by brick, under the weight of his newfound love. The fear remained, a nagging undercurrent, but it was overshadowed by something profoundly different. A profound sense of belonging, a connection so strong it defied logic and years of medical pronouncements. This was more than just paternity. This was a revelation of a soul long dormant, now awakening to a love he never knew existed. The impossible, it seemed, had not just happened. It had begun to heal him. The playroom, a kaleidoscope of primary colors, felt both exhilarating and overwhelming. Liam, a miniature Arthur, frowned in concentration, a tiny replica of his father's usual intense focus. Chloe, however, met Arthur's gaze with an unnerving familiarity, her bright eyes mirroring a depth of understanding far beyond her years. "You're really my daddy?" she whispered, her voice soft as dandelion fluff. Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his emotional turmoil. He knelt, the plush carpet surprisingly soft against his expensive suit. "Yes, sweetheart," he managed, the word feeling both foreign and profoundly right. The scent of baby powder and antiseptic mingled, a strange perfume of his new reality. Finn and Maya, the twins, were a whirlwind of activity, their laughter echoing in the spacious room. He watched, captivated, as they tumbled over each other, their tiny limbs flailing with joyful abandon. It was a stark contrast to the sterile precision of his previous life, a chaotic symphony of pure, unadulterated joy. He reached out a tentative hand, touching Liam's soft hair. The boy looked up, startled at first, then a hesitant smile played on his lips. A wave of emotion, relief, guilt, overwhelming love, crashed over Arthur. He hadn't anticipated this depth of connection, this instant, undeniable bond. The nurse, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, discreetly withdrew. Silence descended, punctuated only by the soft sounds of the children's play. Arthur, for the first time in a long time, felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet contentment that settled deep in his soul. This was his family, flawed, chaotic, and utterly, unexpectedly perfect. The impossible had happened, and in the face of it, he felt not fear, but an overwhelming, liberating love. This was a new beginning, a fresh start amidst the ruins of his carefully constructed past. The next step, he knew, was to face the reality of this profound change with courage and unwavering love. The journey was far from over, but for the first time he felt ready. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Arthur's clothes, a stark reminder of the upheaval in his life. He sat across from Elena in a sun-drenched cafe, the clatter of ceramic cups a muted counterpoint to the turmoil in his heart. Sunlight, warm and inviting, streamed through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a visual representation of the fragile peace he felt. He'd expected anger, recriminations, but instead, Elena's eyes held a weary sadness that mirrored his own. I didn't know," he began, his voice rough with unspoken apologies. The words felt inadequate, pathetically small against the weight of years of silence and missed opportunities. Elena's gaze dropped to her hands, twisting a napkin between her slender fingers. "Neither did I," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the cafe's gentle hum. I thought it was impossible." She looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Losing them, it was my greatest fear." A silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken regrets. Arthur reached across the small table, his hand hovering over hers. He saw the faint tremor in her hand, a mirroring of the anxiety churning within him. He knew he couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the years of separation, but he could offer something else. Understanding, empathy, a genuine desire to share the future. "I want to be a part of their lives," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his chest. "I want to be their father." Elena's eyes met his, a flicker of hesitant hope in their depths. "It won't be easy," she cautioned softly, her voice laced with a quiet strength. They need me." "I know," Arthur replied, his voice gentle, "but they deserve to know me too, and I deserve to know them." He squeezed her hand lightly, offering a silent promise. The touch, fragile yet meaningful, transcended the years of separation, hinting at a tentative bridge being built across a chasm of pain and misunderstanding. The sun warmed his face, casting a golden hue on the tentative smile that played on Elena's lips. The future remained uncertain, the path ahead fraught with challenges. But for the first time, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope, a shared sense of purpose, replacing the bleak emptiness that had haunted him for so long. The impossible had happened, and now he was ready to face it. The sterile white of the hospital room felt oppressive after the sun-drenched cafe. Arthur cradled a tiny, sleeping hand, its skin impossibly soft against his. Liam, the smallest of the quadruplets, was nestled against his chest, his breath a gentle rhythm against Arthur's skin. The scent of baby powder mingled with the faint antiseptic lingering from the examination room. It was a strange, unsettling mixture, a perfect metaphor for his own conflicted emotions. He looked up as Elena entered, her face etched with a mixture of apprehension and hope. The initial awkwardness had given way to a tentative camaraderie, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of an impossible situation. "He's peaceful," Elena murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to break the fragile tranquility of the moment. Her eyes, usually sharp and guarded, were softened with a tenderness Arthur had only glimpsed before. "He's perfect," Arthur replied, his voice thick with emotion. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a primal instinct he hadn't known he possessed. This tiny being, this miniature version of himself, was a tangible link to a future he'd never imagined. A future that held both terrifying uncertainty and a burgeoning sense of love he was only beginning to comprehend. A nurse bustled in, her crisp white uniform a jarring contrast to the intimate scene. She checked Liam's vitals, her efficient movements a silent acknowledgement of the delicate balance of emotions in the room. The interruption, however brief, shattered the fragile peace, replacing it with a subtle tension. Arthur shifted Liam gently, his heart clenching with a protectiveness that surprised him. "They're all doing well," the nurse said, her voice professional, but her eyes held a hint of sympathy. She gave a small, understanding smile before departing, leaving Arthur and Elena alone once more with their unspoken questions and nascent hopes. Elena moved closer, her hand hovering over Liam's tiny foot. The unspoken words hung between them: apologies, explanations, fears. But for now, the simple act of shared presence, the unspoken acknowledgement of their shared responsibility, was enough. The weight of years of separation still pressed heavily between them. Yet in this moment, in the hushed stillness of the hospital room, a tentative bridge was forming, built on shared love for these four small lives who had irrevocably changed both their destinies. Things I thought were long buried. The unspoken accusations hung heavy in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the mistakes and misjudgments that had brought them to this precipice. The faint sound of traffic outside the window was swallowed by the weight of their unspoken anxieties. Arthur squeezed her hand, a gesture both apologetic and resolute. He knew the battle ahead would be brutal, a fight not only for his company, but for the fragile family he had discovered, a family he was fiercely determined to protect. The warmth of her hand in his, the scent of lavender and antiseptic blending in the air, were anchors in the storm, grounding him in the love that had miraculously blossomed amidst the chaos. He had underestimated the lengths his enemies would go to, the depths of their ruthlessness. But he had also underestimated the strength of his love, the unwavering resolve born from the unexpected joy of fatherhood. The fight had begun and he was ready. The lawyer's office felt colder now, the afternoon sun having retreated behind the city's towering skyscrapers. Elena's lavender perfume, once a comforting scent, now carried the sharp edge of her fear. She traced patterns on the mahogany table with a trembling finger, her normally vibrant eyes clouded with a deep, bone-chilling weariness. "They know about the offshore accounts," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the muted hum of the city outside. The revelation hit Arthur like a physical blow. He'd thought he'd sealed that part of his past away, buried it beneath layers of success and carefully constructed respectability. He gripped the arms of his chair, the polished wood digging into his palms. The anger that had fueled him earlier, a righteous fire against those who threatened his children, now felt brittle, inadequate. This wasn't a simple business battle. It was an attack on everything he'd built, on the fragile foundation of his new life. "They'll use it against me," he muttered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Elena nodded, her gaze fixed on her trembling hands. "And against the children," she added, her voice laced with a despair that ripped through Arthur's carefully constructed defenses. The thought of his children, their bright, innocent faces, being dragged into this morass of corporate espionage and personal betrayal sent a wave of nausea washing over him. He had underestimated the ruthlessness of his enemies, their willingness to exploit his vulnerabilities, to weaponize his past against him. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the distant siren wail. Arthur looked at Elena, truly saw her, not just the resilient woman he'd encountered, but a mother fiercely protecting her children. A woman who carried the weight of a shared secret, a past they both desperately tried to outrun. He reached for her hand again, this time not just a gesture of solidarity, but an acknowledgement of their shared pain, their shared responsibility. "We'll fight them," he said, his voice raw with determination. A promise forged not in anger, but in the unwavering love for his children. The fight was no longer just about his company or his past, but about their future, a future he would fiercely protect, no matter the cost. The lavender scent and the chill of the lawyer's office suddenly faded as a new resolve filled the room, a shared commitment born from the unexpected and overwhelming love they had discovered. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Arthur felt a sense of grim, determined hope. The courtroom air hung thick with the scent of old wood polish and simmering tension. Arthur, his expensive suit feeling like a suffocating cage, watched as his rival, Julian Thorne, smirked, a cruel glint in his eye. Thorne's lawyer, A shark in a tailored suit presented damning evidence, meticulously forged documents linking Arthur's offshore accounts to unethical business practices. The whispers from the gallery felt like tiny daggers. Elena sat beside him, her hand a cool, comforting weight in his. Her silence spoke volumes, a silent testament to the fear gnawing at her. He squeezed her hand, offering the only comfort he could muster. The judge's impassive face offered no solace. "This is a significant revelation, Mr. Blackwood." The judge's voice, though neutral, carried the weight of condemnation. The words echoed the chilling certainty in Thorne's predatory smile. That night, back in the sterile luxury of his penthouse, the weight of the day pressed down. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, mirroring the chaos within. Elena sat opposite him, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, each second a hammer blow against his resolve. "They'll take the children," Elena whispered, her voice barely a breath. The fear in her eyes was a stark reflection of his own growing dread. The meticulously crafted life he'd built, the empire he'd spent years erecting, crumbled to dust before him. All that remained was the terrifying reality of a potential future without his children. Arthur reached across the expanse between them, his fingers brushing against hers. He felt the tremor in her hand, the palpable fear that mirrored his own. "We won't let them," he vowed, his voice rough with determination. His resolve, though shaken, was not broken. This fight, he realized, was no longer about his business empire or his damaged reputation. It was about protecting the 4 small lives that had unexpectedly, profoundly, become the center of his world. The fight was about his family, and he would fight for them with every fiber of his being. The rain outside intensified, but within the quiet sanctuary of his penthouse, a different kind of storm brewed, a storm of fierce, unwavering love. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the plush comfort of Arthur's usual surroundings. Elena's silence was a palpable presence, her gaze fixed on the swirling patterns of the Persian rug. The rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the tempest raging within them. "There after everything, Arthur?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. The fear in her eyes was a raw, open wound. He reached across the chasm that had separated them for so long, his hand covering hers. Her skin was cool, trembling slightly beneath his touch. "We'll fight them," he murmured, his voice rough with a newfound determination. The words were a promise not just to her, but to himself. He wouldn't let Julian Thorne or anyone take what was rightfully his children. The grandfather clock chimed, each toll a heavy beat against the silence. The city lights, a glittering tapestry of defiance against the darkness, seemed to mock his vulnerability. Yet, within the suffocating luxury of his penthouse, a fragile seed of hope took root. He looked into Elena's eyes, seeing not just fear, but a flicker of the same fierce resolve that burned within him. I didn't know," he began, his voice catching in his throat. The words felt inadequate, clumsy, against the weight of years of silence and unspoken regret. He felt the raw, unfiltered shame of his past actions. He knew an apology would be insufficient, but it was a start. Elena nodded slowly, her gaze still locked on his. "I know," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "But it's not about the past anymore. It's about the future. About them." She gestured towards a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. For beaming faces, miniature reflections of Arthur's own features. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, but within the room, a tentative truce had been called. The battle for his company, for his reputation, still raged, but within the quiet understanding between them, a new fight was beginning, a fight for their family, a fight for their future. The weight of the legal battle was immense, but now, they faced it together, united by a love forged in the crucible of unforeseen circumstances and a shared determination. The fight had become personal, visceral. It was a fight for the 4 small lives that had irrevocably changed their lives forever. The mahogany table felt cold beneath Arthur's hands, the polished surface reflecting the flickering candlelight. Elena sat opposite, her profile sharp against the deep crimson of the drapes. The air, thick with unspoken accusations, crackled with tension. Outside, the city hummed a relentless, indifferent tune. "Julian Thorne is relentless," Elena said, her voice low, laced with a weariness that mirrored his own. The scent of expensive perfume clung to her, a stark contrast to the raw fear in her eyes. He saw it, the flicker of doubt that threatened to extinguish the fragile hope he'd begun to nurture. Arthur reached across the space between them, his hand hovering over hers. He hesitated, the ghost of his past coldness chilling him. He remembered the icy distance he had cultivated, the wall he'd built around his heart. This time, he wouldn't let fear dictate his actions. "He won't win," Arthur said, his voice rough but firm. "We won't let him." He felt a surge of protective anger, a primal instinct to shield these fragile lives, his children, from the storm brewing around them. The weight of his responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. Elena met his gaze, her eyes searching his. For a moment, the years of separation, of misunderstandings, seemed to melt away. He saw a glimmer of the woman he'd glimpsed in fragmented memories, resilient, strong, and fiercely protective of her children. "It's not just about the company, is it?" she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. The rain outside intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm against the glass. "No," Arthur admitted, his throat tight with emotion. "It's about them, about our children." He looked towards the framed photograph on the mantelpiece, for small faces gazing back at him, their smiles a beacon in the encroaching darkness. The vulnerability he'd so carefully hidden for years surfaced, raw and potent. He was afraid, terribly afraid of losing them. But the fear was overshadowed by a burgeoning love, a fierce protectiveness that surprised even him. Elena reached out, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was electric, a silent acknowledgement of their shared commitment. The battle ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time, they stood united. The flickering candlelight danced across their faces, casting long shadows on the walls, but in the heart of the storm, a small spark of hope flickered brightly. The fight was on. The courtroom was a glacial tomb, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and simmering resentment. Arthur, his tailored suit feeling like a suffocating cage, watched Julian Thorne, his rival, a predator in bespoke fabric, address the judge. Thorne's words, sharp and precise, were designed to dissect Arthur's character, to paint him as unfit, unstable. The weight of it pressed down, threatening to crush him. He felt Elena's hand, cool and reassuring, clasp his beneath the mahogany table. "He's lying?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible above the hushed murmur of the courtroom. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own, but there was also a steely resolve that both surprised and comforted him. The judge's gavel fell, sharp and decisive, silencing Thorne's venomous accusations. Arthur's lawyer, a formidable woman with eyes as sharp as flint, rose to her feet, her voice a calming counterpoint to the storm. She meticulously dismantled Thorne's claims, exposing their flimsy foundations. The hours stretched, each moment a relentless assault on Arthur's composure. He watched the faces of the jury, searching for any sign of their judgment. Doubt gnawed at him, the doubt Thorne had so skillfully planted. He glanced at the small framed photo of his children, tucked discreetly into his breast pocket. Their smiling faces were his anchor in this tempestuous sea. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom floor as the judge delivered her verdict. The words, crisp and clear, hung in the air, a fragile promise of resolution. Custody would be shared, with Arthur having significant time with the children. A wave of relief, so potent it nearly brought him to his knees, washed over him. He squeezed Elena's hand. The victory felt bittersweet, a hard-fought battle won, but with deep scars remaining. The fight for his children, and for his very self, had only just begun. He looked at Elena, saw the unshed tears glistening in her eyes, and knew they were far from finished fighting. The battle for their future, for the legacy he intended to build, was far from over. Yet in that shared victory, in the silent understanding passing between them, a fragile hope bloomed, a promise of a future built on something more substantial than wealth or power. The judge's words hung in the air, heavy with legal jargon, yet light with a surprising kindness. Shared custody, a compromise but a victory nonetheless. Relief washed over Arthur, a tidal wave erasing the weeks of gnawing anxiety. He squeezed Elena's hand, the pressure a silent acknowledgement of their shared ordeal. He saw the shimmer of unshed tears in her eyes, a reflection of his own exhaustion. The courtroom, previously a sterile battleground, now felt strangely quiet. The hushed whispers of the departing crowd faded, replaced by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The scent of old wood and polished mahogany replaced the sharp tang of tension. Arthur stood, legs unsteady, the weight of the past few months pressing down. He felt Elena's hand in his, a lifeline in the swirling aftermath. "We did it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Elena's smile was fragile, a tentative bloom after a harsh winter. "We did," she echoed, her voice thick with emotion. "But it's only the beginning." He looked at her, truly saw her, beyond the legal battles and accusations. He saw the weariness, the resilience, the love etched into her face. He saw a woman who had fought tirelessly for her children, for their future, a woman he was only beginning to understand. Their walk out of the courthouse was a slow procession, the heavy doors closing behind them with a soft thud, shutting away the noise and conflict. The sunlight felt unexpectedly warm on his face, a stark contrast to the cold intensity of the courtroom. He could almost taste the freedom, like sweet wine on his tongue. The car ride was filled with a comfortable silence, punctuated by the occasional soft sigh or shared glance. The city rushed past, a blurry tapestry of color and motion, but their world remained contained within the confines of the car. The shared weight of their victory and the uncertainty of the future bound them together in a way no court order could ever define. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but looking at Elena, at the quiet strength in her eyes, he knew they could face it together. For their children, for themselves, for the future they were forging brick by fragile brick. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Arthur's clothes, a phantom reminder of the courtroom's cold heart. He sat in the back of the chauffeured car, the leather cool against his skin, the city lights blurring into streaks of color outside. Elena sat beside him, her face pale but serene, a fragile mask concealing the exhaustion etched into her eyes. Silence stretched between them, a comfortable silence born not of indifference, but of shared understanding. He reached for her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. Her skin was soft, almost ethereal. "It's over," he murmured, the words feeling both momentous and inadequate. She squeezed his hand, a faint smile playing on her lips. "For now," she corrected softly, her voice husky. "The real work begins now." He nodded, the weight of his newfound responsibility settling upon him. The legal victory felt hollow, a mere stepping stone. The true challenge lay in building a family, in navigating the complex terrain of shared custody, of co-parenting with a woman he'd only recently come to know and understand. The thought both exhilarated and terrified him. The fear of failure gnawed at him, a constant, low thrum of anxiety beneath the surface of his relief. The car pulled up to his penthouse, the familiar opulence feeling strangely alien. The gleaming marble floors, the priceless artwork, the panoramic city view, all seemed trivial, insignificant against the weight of the emotional tapestry woven over the past few months. He glanced at Elena, her gaze distant, lost in her own thoughts. He knew that she, too, was contemplating the uncertain future, the long road ahead. Their shared journey was far from over. This was merely a fragile truce, a tentative beginning. The unspoken promise hung in the air, heavy with the weight of responsibility and the fragile hope for a future they would create together, for the 4 small faces that mirrored his own, waiting for him at home. The warmth of their future was a slow burn, promising light but requiring time and patience. The drive had been quiet, a sanctuary of shared experience, a prelude to the work that lay ahead. The penthouse felt alien, a gilded cage. Arthur sank onto the plush sofa, the soft leather doing little to soothe the tremor in his hands. The city sprawled beneath him, a breathtaking panorama of glittering lights. Yet all Arthur saw was the blurry reflection of his own exhausted face in the glass. Elena, quiet beside him, cradled a steaming mug, the faint aroma of chamomile a stark contrast to the metallic tang of anxiety that clung to him. "They're asleep," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the hum of the city. Her eyes, usually bright with a fierce spirit, were shadowed with fatigue. The fight, the relentless legal battle, had taken its toll. He nodded, unable to speak. The victory felt hollow, a Pyrrhic win. He'd secured custody, yes, but at what cost? The image of Elena's face, pale and strained in the harsh courtroom lights, haunted him. He'd seen the fear in her eyes, the unspoken plea for understanding, for acceptance. I'm sorry," he finally managed, the words catching in his throat. He hadn't known how to express the guilt that gnawed at him, the regret for years of absence, of ignorance. Elena met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She set down her mug, the delicate china clinking softly against the glass tabletop. "It's not over," she repeated, her voice firm despite the weariness in her eyes. "We have a long way to go." He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was cool, her grip surprisingly strong. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding of the arduous journey ahead. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the unspoken promises, the weight of responsibility, the fragile hope for a future that was only just beginning. The fight for his children hadn't ended in the courtroom. It had just begun. A battle fought not in court, but in the quiet intimacy of family life, in the daily struggle of building a relationship with the four small faces that mirrored his own. The road ahead was uncertain, yet in Elena's hand, in the shared weight of their new reality, he felt a flicker of hope, a tentative promise of a future worth fighting for. A future where the gilded cage of his penthouse might finally become a home. The courtroom's sterile scent of disinfectant lingered, a stark contrast to the earthy aroma of the chamomile tea Elena held. Arthur watched her, the lines etched around her eyes mirroring his own exhaustion. The victory felt hollow, a brutal fight won at a terrible cost. He'd secured custody, but the image of Elena's pale face, the unspoken plea in her eyes, haunted him. He'd fought for them, for his children, but had he truly fought with them? "It's not over," Elena repeated, her voice a low murmur against the quiet hum of the penthouse. The city lights, blurred through the rain-streaked windows, seemed to mock his triumph. He reached for her hand, his fingers tracing the delicate lines on her palm. Her skin was cool, her grip surprisingly firm. I'm sorry," he stammered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The apology felt inadequate, a feeble attempt to bridge the chasm of years of absence. Elena's gaze met his, unwavering. The years of resentment, of quiet suffering, seemed to weigh heavily in the silence that followed. He saw a flicker of something else though, weariness, yes, but also acceptance, a shared understanding of the colossal task ahead. "We need to talk," she finally said, her voice laced with a quiet strength. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties, with the weight of responsibility for four small lives. The scent of rain, sharp and clean, invaded the penthouse, a cleansing wash against the lingering bitterness of the battle. He saw in her eyes a willingness to start again, a tentative bridge built across a chasm he himself had helped create. The fight for his children hadn't ended. It had merely shifted, from the courtroom to the quiet, intimate battlefield of their lives. A battle fought not with lawyers and documents, but with love, patience, and an immense capacity for forgiveness. And for the first time, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope that, perhaps, he was ready. The judge's gavel still echoed in Arthur's ears, a dull thrumming against the sudden, unsettling silence of the penthouse. He looked out at the city, a million pinpricks of light blurring through the rain-lashed windows. The victory felt less like a triumph and more like a reprieve, a temporary stay of execution in a war that had only just begun. He'd won custody, yes, but at what cost? Elena stood by the window, her silhouette etched against the cityscape, a solitary figure bearing the weight of unspoken burdens. The scent of rain, sharp and clean, mingled with the faint, lingering aroma of chamomile, a fragile peace offering in the aftermath of a brutal battle. The lawyers, they're handling the paperwork. Arthur began, his voice hoarse, the words catching in his throat. He turned, his gaze falling on the delicate silver chain Elena wore, a simple pendant shimmering faintly in the dim light. He remembered buying it for her years ago, a fleeting moment of connection now shrouded in the haze of regret. Elena didn't reply immediately, her gaze fixed on the swirling rain outside. He saw the fatigue etched into her face, the subtle tremors in her hands as she clutched the steaming mug. Years of quiet suffering, of sacrifices made in the shadows, were reflected in the deep lines around her eyes. The weight of it all pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. "They want me to sign something about visitation rights," she finally said, her voice low, almost a whisper. The words hung heavy in the air, charged with a complexity that went beyond legal jargon. He saw the fear in her eyes, a vulnerability that cut through the carefully constructed wall of resilience she'd maintained for so long. It was the fear of losing her children, of not being a part of their lives. A fear he understood viscerally. Arthur crossed the room, the polished marble floor cool beneath his feet. He stopped beside her, the distance between them shrinking to almost nothing. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, hesitant, unsure. The rain continued its relentless assault against the glass, mirroring the tempest raging within him. "We'll work it out," he murmured, his voice softer now, laced with a sincerity he hoped she could hear beyond the words. He needed to make amends, to bridge the gulf that separated them, to find a path forward. The road ahead was long and arduous, strewn with obstacles both emotional and legal. But for the first time since receiving those impossible test results, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile flame flickering against the darkness. The battle for his children was far from over, but now, at least, it was a battle he would fight alongside Elena, not against her. The legal battle's aftermath hung heavy, a damp wool blanket draped over the opulent penthouse. Sunlight, weak and hesitant, filtered through the rain-streaked windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Arthur, exhausted but strangely at peace, cradled a sleeping quadruplet, his tiny hand gripping Arthur's finger with surprising strength. The scent of baby powder and chamomile tea mingled in the air, a fragile truce after the war. Elena entered, her face pale but composed. She carried a tray laden with steaming mugs and a plate of croissants, the delicate pastries a stark contrast to the brutal reality they'd both just endured. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding woven from shared trauma and burgeoning hope. "He's out cold," Arthur murmured, his voice thick with sleep-deprived tenderness. He gently placed the sleeping child in his crib, the soft sigh escaping his lips a testament to his exhaustion. Elena smiled, a small, weary curve of her lips. "They're all like that after a long day of, well, everything." She set the tray down on a nearby table, the clinking of ceramic against marble a soft counterpoint to the silence. "The paperwork?" Arthur began, his gaze drifting to the window, the cityscape shimmering beneath the retreating rain. "It's overwhelming." Elena nodded, understanding lacing her tone. "My lawyer said it could take months, but the important thing is, they're safe. With you." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, a vulnerability that mirrored his own. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing beyond the resilience, beyond the carefully constructed walls. He saw the woman behind the mother, the woman who had carried his children for 9 months, alone, yet still willing to share the future. "We need to talk," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "About us, about everything." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. About forgiveness, about shared responsibility, about the future, about building a life, not just a legal victory. The scent of chamomile still lingered in the air, a promise of peace, a fragile hope blossoming amidst the ruins of a battle won. The rain had stopped, and a single ray of sunlight pierced the clouds, illuminating a path forward. A future, uncertain yet full of potential, lay before them. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be walked together. The judge's gavel fell, a final, resounding clang that echoed the turmoil of the past months. Arthur felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He'd won custody. The children were his. But the victory felt hollow. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary, felt more like a gilded cage. The scent of antiseptic still clung to the air, a phantom reminder of the sterile hospital room where his life had irrevocably shifted. Elena, across the mahogany table, didn't smile. Her eyes, dark pools reflecting a storm of emotions, held a mixture of exhaustion and a brittle sort of peace. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of shared history. The air crackled with the aftermath of the legal battle, a palpable tension clinging to the expensive furniture. "The lawyers," they said. Arthur began, his voice rough, the words catching in his throat. He reached for a water glass, his hand trembling slightly. The cool glass felt strangely comforting against his skin. Elena's gaze softened fractionally. "They said it's over. For now." She pushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture betraying her underlying anxiety. The lines etched around her eyes spoke of sleepless nights and relentless worry. The scent of her perfume, a faint, floral scent, was almost overwhelmed by the lingering smell of the expensive legal documents scattered across the table. He saw in her tired eyes the sacrifice she had made, the years of single motherhood, the quiet strength that had sustained her through it all. Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. I owe you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He meant more than he could articulate. He owed her an apology, an explanation, a lifetime of amends. Elena looked down at her hands, twisting a silver ring around her finger. "We'll work it out," she replied, her voice barely above a murmur, the words carefully chosen, as if she was testing the fragile peace between them. The faint clinking of ice in her water glass cut through the silence, a delicate counterpoint to the unresolved tension. The opulent setting felt utterly insignificant, dwarfed by the magnitude of their shared experience. A new chapter, uncertain yet full of potential, was about to begin. The legal battle's conclusion hung heavy in the air, a silence thick with unspoken anxieties. Arthur's penthouse, usually a bastion of calm, felt claustrophobic. The scent of expensive leather and polished wood couldn't mask the lingering antiseptic tang, a constant reminder of the sterile environment where his life had fractured and reformed. He looked at Elena, her face etched with fatigue, her eyes holding a carefully constructed composure. The expensive mahogany table separating them felt like a chasm. "The lawyers," they said, "shared custody." Arthur began, his voice a low rumble, the words catching in his throat. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. He felt the weight of his past actions, the years of absence, pressing down on him. Elena met his gaze, her expression unreadable. The faint scent of her perfume, a delicate floral note, was a stark contrast to the sterile smell that still clung to his clothes. "Shared custody," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. A fragile peace clung to the air, but beneath it, the undercurrent of resentment and unresolved issues pulsed. He watched her carefully, searching her face for any sign of the anger he expected. Instead, he saw a weariness that mirrored his own. The battle hadn't just been legal. It had been a war fought within themselves, a conflict that had left both scarred.